And thank you, the organisers, for inviting me. I'm quite honoured to be invited to speak to you in this during this conference. And especially, again, thanks to Kevin, when he asked me to do this keynote. I think it was about a year ago, or maybe half a year. I think it was a year ago, about. He had some very clear ideas as about what about I should be talking, and so maybe you can sort of sketch the Dutch situation with regard to the Common European Framework of Reference, because it will be an international audience. And oh yes, and maybe you can say something about the connection between dynamic systems theory and the Common European Framework. And then about 2 weeks ago, I said yes, and maybe you can add. I mean, you'll be the last keynote, so maybe you can sort of connect what all the others have been saying. So that's what I'll be doing. I'll try not to turn it into chaos, but it also gives an insight into the organisation and the great structure of the organisation. And I was also pleased to see the wide variety of presentations topics, yet within a very clear focus: the learner and the teacher and the use the language portfolio. Kevin's request to do something with DST in relation to the Common European Framework is sort of a matter of course, because once you're infected by DST, once you've seen the light, I can almost, then it's very difficult not to do that. It changes the perspective on research. Indeed, I will be saying something about the Dutch situation in the Netherlands with regard to the Common European Framework. I will also, my PowerPoint's not on yet. There we go. This really helps. So the title is the Common European Framework in the Netherlands: Trends and Challenges. The first part, actually there's three parts in my presentation. First of all, there is the Common European Framework in the Netherlands. That will be about 5 minutes. Trends, which will be slightly more general, and also no more than 5 minutes. And the challenges is the rest of the talk. So and that goes beyond the Dutch situation. This is the structure, and so indeed it's not complete chaos. Talking about the Common European Framework in the Netherlands, the Dutch term for the European Framework, and that is the term that you may have seen in the past couple of days, is Europees Referentiekader, so ERK, that is the Dutch abbreviation. And a lot is being done in the Netherlands for the European framework, in terms of the European framework, so the ERK. And the Netherlands also has its own manual, which is called Taalprofielen, which, if you study it carefully, is at points quite different from the original manual. So an adaptation to the Dutch situation, you can say. There are many tools available. An amazingly well-developed website maintained hosted by SLO, Stichting Leerplanontwikkeling, who take care of most of the examinations and so on. Is Daniela still here? And if we go to that website briefly, we can see that on the website a reference is made, links and tools are made available for school leaders, employers, teachers and pupils. So these are the different stakeholders involved in the European framework. And for all of them, there's a wealth of information available. I was involved in sideways in a study that Rick de Graaf and his colleagues did in Utrecht, in which they set up a big questionnaire about the use of the European framework in secondary schools in the Netherlands. And the survey was held among 373 language teachers, 67 school managers, 120 teacher trainers and 44 publishers, so respondents from all these different parties. And the conclusions, if I can, I mean, it's a big report, so it's I'm not doing justice to the report in this one-line summary, but it is very clearly still seen as a very new development by all parties, and yet we've been. It's 10 years since the European framework was initiated for our use. A new development, and the familiarity with the framework varies widely between the different people involved. And slightly disappointingly, if we look at the language teachers, about 60% say at least they are sort of familiar, and there were some questions about the Common European Framework, and they turned out to be rather familiar with it. But there were about 40% who were who never, not that they never heard of it, maybe they heard about the labels, but they didn't know what was behind it. School management knew what the CEF is for PR reasons, of course, they know about the labels. Teacher trainers are more familiar with it, and so are the publishers. But it's especially disappointing that the language teachers are not massively familiar with the European framework, given the tools that are available. If we look at the use of the framework in higher education in the Netherlands, maybe it is even slightly more disappointing. And that's also what we saw. We will have to connect this to the talks that we saw during this conference. If we look at the use of the electronic language portfolio, for instance, there is hardly any use in higher education. And then I think we should make a distinction between, well, roughly speaking, professionals in language teaching training and amateurs. And the amateurs, in terms of proficiency teaching, are most people at universities who teach linguistics and literature, and who do their language proficiency teaching on the side. And it's not their primary interest, and they are not trained in proficiency teaching, and that is most language teachers in the language departments. And then we can see a big contrast, and I think I have a safe audience here to say that it's the language centers where the professionals are, who are professionally engaged in language teaching. And so there is a very important role for language centers, I think, in that sense. And that's a message for all language centers, I think, in the Netherlands, and trying to get it going, as we can see at our university. It's the language center sort of that keeps it going, and then the English department and the Spanish department and the other departments, they sort of follow the language center in the development. That is the situation. It's not a very positive note after 10 years. 10 years after the introduction of the Common European Framework. The difficulties that are mentioned is that it's a completely different line of thinking. It focuses on what learners can do, not on the errors. And of course, maybe not of course, but in language departments, the focus is still very much on what people do wrong and on accuracy. And the trend towards what learners can do is a major shift, and it's a difficult step to make. Learner autonomy, especially for secondary education, I think that is a major challenge. Learner autonomy can mean, need not mean, but can mean less teacher control. And teachers want to be in control of the learning process. I will come back to that later on as well. There's a focus on communication and on competences, so not just on accuracy. The descriptors are vague, that is what people generally say, and it has a limited suitability for assessment, and a large part of what we've been talking about in the past couple of days has been on assessment, and it's also something I'll come back to in a minute. The question is, the people who are skeptical, reluctant, maybe careful, are they right? And to answer that question, we have to know something more about what language learning actually is. And for that, I need the dynamic systems perspective, obviously. It is often assumed, it's used as a metaphor, that language learning develops linearly from no knowledge to full proficiency. And in terms of the European framework labels, maybe we can say that we develop from, is there a pointer? It develops from A1 to C2. Maybe not in a straight line, but that is the underlying idea. And it's not only the underlying idea of the metaphor of our thinking about language development, it's also the underlying assumption of most research and theories and models of language development. And that is a big problem. So rather than assuming that it's a straight line or a completely linear development, we also know that there's a fair chance that at one point it sort of levels out and there's no further learning. So that is sometimes referred to as fossilization, something that you may recognize. And even worse, after a period of non-use, we can even see attrition. And the study of attrition has now been developed into a full branch of applied linguistics in itself. And people like Monica Schmid and Bert Weltens, and in the past also Kees Pot, are mainly focusing on attrition because it's informative about the acquisition process as well. So if this is the pattern, then there is something else that we have to be aware of. On the horizontal axis, there was time in this slide, and that could be interpreted in terms of years. And then this is the development over the lifespan. And the fact that the development stops at 70, 75, so it's not meaningful at all. I have to stop somewhere. So if you're close to retirement, don't despair. You can still maybe I should have gone on to 120 and then, just don't worry about that. But this can be seen as lifespan development. So there's growth, there is fossilization, and if you don't use language, second language, or also the first language when you go to another country and you're not exposed to the language, you don't use it anymore, then it will decline. Now this is the year timescale, and one of the studies that we're currently doing is looking at the lifespan timescale. That's a study by Nika van den Hoeven, one of our PhDs, and she's looking at language development and decline at later age. Exactly the same pattern can be found when we change the timescale. 2 months or 2 weeks. Yes, and that's the timescale that we have used a lot in many longitudinal case studies investigating development of second language. And then, for instance, we've been looking at a period of 4 or 5 years with weekly measurements to see how language develops. And then this may be an overall pattern. But when we zoom in at the day level, we can see the same pattern again. And even at an hourly level, and minutes, and even milliseconds. And actually, one of the studies that we have been doing in the past couple of years is a longitudinal repeated study investigating language representations of the lexicon with reaction times. And then you can still see the same pattern. So this means we can keep zooming in to see a sort of recursive pattern, which means, of course, that if we project the millisecond level and the hour level and so on the day level, we get a pattern like this. So this is typically the kind of developmental pattern that we see. By the way, this is not purely coincidental, it's not just a line, this is typical for the development. You can see there's a lot of variation, and then there seems to be a developmental jump. And that's indeed what we see. Now this is the day scale, and we can keep on zooming in, and so there is never an end to the extent at which we can zoom in and see the pattern of growth and decline, growth and maybe for a short while fossilization or stabilization and decline and growth and so on and so forth. This may remind you of Mandelbrot's reference to the measuring the coastline of Britain. The length of the coastline is completely dependent on the yardstick that we use. So the finer the yardstick is, the longer the coastline is. And the same holds for language development. If we look at changes at the minute level, we can see variability. And we can see the same pattern in days and years and so on and so forth. Now, to complicate matters further, this is going to be slightly discouraging if if you want to keep track of what is happening in learners. This can be seen as one of the competencies. So this would, for instance, be spoken interaction. These, of course, are made up data, just for illustration, but they represent the data that we have found in the past 5 or 6 years. So this could be spoken interaction, and of course there can be writing, which has its own timescale and its own development. And there can be vocabulary development, which again has its own timescale and its own development. So this means that if in one learner, this could potentially be the developmental pattern. And to even worry you a little bit further, if you look at the levels of the European framework from A1 to C2 on the left, this is not actually how it works, because this is more likely to be the scale. So the step from C1 to C2 may be much bigger than the step between A1 and A2, for the simple reason that you may be familiar with this picture, that there's much more to be learned and many more domains to be covered in the C2 level, and there's also cognitive skills to be developed at the higher levels. And the smaller domains, you can look at the can-dos, and they're pretty simple and close together at the lower levels. So this is the picture that is emerging, and this is what we see from the data. So how can we make sense of that data? And this is one of the reasons why we needed dynamic systems theory to account for that, because this is far removed from our ideal picture of language development as a linear line, a linear pattern. So this is not very likely. So I'll have to say a few words on what dynamic systems are, and then hopefully you can sort of connect it. It would be not very difficult to talk about dynamic systems for the coming 2 hours, but there is a time limit, isn't there? That's okay. Very briefly said. By the way, this slide has an asterisk because I borrowed it from a colleague from Paul van Geert. A system is a collection of components that are related to each other, and I thought of a picture which will come in a minute. And a dynamic system is a collection of changing components that influence each other. So this would be the picture of the static system, the system, and this would be the picture that is a very unrepresentative picture, because it's in 2 dimensions only, of a dynamic system. So we have components that in themselves are constantly changing and that influence each other over time. And dynamic systems theory is a theory of change over time. So if we look at spoken interaction, it is not the case that we find that there is a linear pattern of development that we can simply explain in, for instance, an equation that one factor develops as a function of another factor, but each factor develops as a function of itself at the previous moment in time. So maybe we can represent it this way. First of all, there's the equation, which says the pattern of development for each component of the system is that it is development of itself at the next stage in time. So that is something like this. And so it's an iterative development. So it is difficult what the development will be like in 10 steps from here. We can say what the next step will be and maybe the next step, but in 10 steps we have no idea what it's going to be like. And then of course there are several components. There's not only spoken interaction, if I say that as a component, but also vocabulary, where we have a similar pattern of development, and also writing, and these are only 3 of a wide set of components. And of course there is an influence across those components. And this is indeed when we do time series analyses and going beyond the use of a metaphor. So we have thus far used DST as a metaphor, but if we use it from the physical point of view and try to make a sense of development using these equations, and we have slightly bigger equations to account for that, then we can see indeed that is the case using time series analysis. The characteristics of dynamic systems are, it consists of interconnected subsystems, there is self-organization, and we can see that the development consequently is non-linear. Dynamic systems has been introduced into language learning some time ago, like 5-6 years ago, by people in Groningen, and before that also by in Michigan by Diane Larson-Freeman, who actually started talking about complex systems in 1997. And Kevin referred to dynamic systems as being something that we've developed in Groningen, but of course not only in Groningen. We've been collaborating with research groups all over the world, among whom Nick Ellis and Diane Larson-Freeman, Philippe Herdina in Innsbruck, and so many parties that are involved. This is the emerging picture. And I'll try to illustrate these characteristics of dynamic systems using examples from the physical world, because if we talk about mental development, it's so much more difficult to come to grips with that. Now this is an example of self-organization, and this the picture is a sand dune, and you can see the ripples in the sand dune, and the ripples are there because of the system, because of the nature and the characteristics of the system. And if you try to erase the ripples and you come back the next day, you will see that they will re-emerge almost identically. And this is what we refer to as attractors of the system. This is what the system will go to. This is the pattern of development that this system wants to develop. And there you can also see that a system will never exist in itself. It is development in relation to the context. And that is, of course, also very relevant for language development. Another very important characteristic of dynamic systems is that it consists of subsystems, and the subsystems are nested. Now this is an example of a flock of birds, and especially this time of year you can see lots of them. And you can see that the whole flock is moving through the sky, and that means that each and every individual bird is moving. And as an individual, you cannot decide to move in another direction. You have to go with the flow, but at the same time, there is a collective movement. So although there is collective development over time, because it's about change over time, it's the individual birds that make the group. So it is, that's an example of subsystem. And if we take the step to language development, then we can maybe regard the atmosphere as so the whole sphere, the sky, and the wind, and the pressure, and so on, as the context, as the environment, and the language user could be, the language system could be one of those birds, and inside the birds we have the blood vessels and the nervous system and so on, which are again embedded systems. The systems, the subsystems are all interconnected, and because each subsystem has its own development, the pattern of development that we find in the end is what we can refer to as chaos. Chaos meaning not random development, but meaning not fully predictable. And a very nice example of a dynamic system in that sense is the weather. And I should add, and that was pointed out to me some time ago by a colleague, that when we use the weather as an example of a dynamic system, we have to refer to the weather in the Western Hemisphere, in this country, for instance, because of course, when you go to Death Valley, it will be pretty stable. But in this area, the weather is, we can say what the weather will be like tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, but next week, we don't know, let alone in 2 weeks. And so that is a very typical example of a dynamic system. Another characteristic, and you may be familiar with the butterfly effect, is the initial condition of the dynamic systems. Now to make it slightly more realistic, but also maybe more challenging, we have all these systems, and it's very difficult to imagine what it looks like. And this is what it looks like. This is what's called a space state, or a state space. Opinions differ. The state space is a matter of repellers and attractors, and each and every single subsystem can be seen as one dimension in space state. So it should be seen as a multi-dimensional system, multi-dimensional state space. All the dimensions of the system are one dimension in the state space. Which brings us to variability. And in dynamic systems theory, variability is very, very meaningful. And now you can see where I'm going, because that's what I started off with, referring to the variability in language data. Variability is the result of the intrinsic dynamics of the system and the interaction of all the components, including the context, which is in fact a super system. And in research that has taken linear development as one of their assumptions, variability is usually regarded as noise, distracting from the real thing, from the real competence or the real development. From a dynamic systems theory perspective, we are regarding the variability as valuable information, no longer as noise. The information is in that noise. And to illustrate that, why is variability so meaningful? If we only think of evolution, especially also in language evolution, if there is no variation, there can never be change. If things stay the same, then things stay the same. And we can see, and also in language development, as I demonstrated in the graph, we can see a lot of variability, and then we can see a developmental change, sort of a jump in the development. And variability is considered to be the result of the flexibility and adaptability of the system to the environment. And maybe a nice example of variability, we've been talking about cycling. Anya mentioned that you have to watch out for the bike riders in this town. They come from all corners. They don't have their lights on, and it can be very dangerous. Usually these, and they're fast too, but these bike riders are usually pretty well developed and have good control over their bikes. When you start to learn riding your bike, you'll be swinging about. And in the end, you can do it on a flat, smooth surface. But then, if the environment changes and you have to deal with cobbles, for instance, then it may be more challenging. You may be swaying about and even fall. So you will go to the next stage of development. You will vary, and then you will find your way of dealing with it. And we can find the same pattern of development in language development. This is also the case when you, for instance, try to, and this is no way you can read this, but this is from a website that illustrates how to learn to ride your bike without using your hands. And then they say, start on a flat, smooth surface. Absolutely, start on a flat, smooth surface. And then you will vary and you'll get hold of it, and then you'll go one step further in more difficult circumstances, and then you will develop further, and so on, and so forth. And the final remark is, always wear a helmet. So maybe if we use this as a metaphor for language development, I don't know where the helmet comes in, but you can imagine that we go through stages of development. This is an example from our data in which variability is very clearly illustrated. Here we have followed the writing of one learner during a period of, I think, 2 years this was. It's from a paper that we published in 2008. And we is Kees de Bord, Marjolein Verspoor, and myself. And here you can see two characteristics. That is, the blue line represents type token ratios, so we can say that is the creativity in vocabulary use. And the purple line, or pink, purple line, represents the average sentence length. So that is a sort of a complexity measure. And then you can see that when one goes up, the other one goes down. There seems to be a very clear negative relationship between these two. So apparently it's very difficult to pay attention to two things at the same time. This is that is the link to the smooth surface. Yeah, so you can't pay attention to everything at the same time. You have to start with one thing at a time. And this is not about teaching or instruction, but this is just about the development. And this is a very striking development that we've seen in combinations of all kinds of variables. Writing, vocabulary, speaking skills, everything is related. And sometimes that relationship is not obvious and complex. So in sum, and this was a very brief introduction to dynamic systems, but in view of the time, that's all we can do at the moment. We're talking about interacting subsystems, which is the result of self-organization of the system, that is the multidimensional state space, which is sensitive to the initial condition. It's constantly changing, depending on the resources, that is the context, and then the result of that is attractors and repellers. And maybe if we think of L1 influence on L2, that could be one of the attractors. And we may fall back into the L1 habits that we already have. And variability is a very clear characteristic of that system. Now, if we think about this is the development that we find, and this is how we can apply dynamic systems to language learning, then what actually is learning? When does learning take place? Well, what we've seen so far, and also if we look at the theories of from physics and also from cognitive development, quite a bit of research has been done in developmental psychology in this area. Learning is the effect of self-reorganization after perturbation takes place. And whether the perturbation of the system is successful, that depends on the phases of the system, the learner characteristics, and also the context in which learning takes place. And most importantly, it's individually determined. So learning is an individual process. The idea of self-organization is very strong. Self-organization not as the lonely learner that is learning on his or her own, but learning in the context of the environment. And this could be the state space and then the learning that takes place. And you can see the ball, that is the trajectory of learning, will never go to the hills, but always go to the valleys. And those are the detractors to make it slightly more visible, which is difficult because it's an abstract concept. So if we know about dynamic systems and about what learning is from that point of view, how does that match up with the Common European Framework? Well, we've seen that learning is an individual process. Well, that is what we've seen in the basic idea of Common European Framework. Learner autonomy is absolutely crucial. It's the learner that develops. It's the self-organizing learner. And maybe all we can do, we cannot learn people. We can maybe teach. But teaching then is creating an optimal learning environment. But we cannot do the learning. And English very conveniently has two verbs for that. We cannot learn people. People have to learn. And the teaching we can do is creating optimal conditions. So learning is an individual process. And communicative abilities is very central in the Common European Framework, and from the point of view of development, self-organization, learning and use is the same thing. And we cannot distinguish between learning and use. We have to learn through use and use through learning. And we need a rich environment. Well, very clearly, development is dependent on the environment. So if we think of the idea of a language portfolio, that very, very clearly links up with the idea of an individual learner developing. So we go back to one of the previous slides, where we saw that people are sometimes reluctant to use the framework. Then the question is, are they right? Well, no, because the picture that emerges from the European framework is fully compatible with what we know about learning as an individual process. Then why is there a gap between the practice and our beautiful theory and what we know about learning? Well, first of all, learner autonomy on the one hand, its idea, that is what we need. At the same time, teachers want to be in control. And I recently spoke to a teacher in a secondary school, and he was fully convinced that the only way that learners can learn is as long as he controls what is going on. Teachers want to be in control. Individual guidance is absolutely important, and that's what we can see in the language portfolio. That's probably the way out. But we have to deal with large groups, especially in secondary schools, and also at universities. We have to deal with large groups of learners that are learning at the same time. So how can we combine that with the ideal of individual guidance? Learning is use, okay, but is there time to use language, to develop, to learn? A focus on communication, but traditionally there's been a strong focus on grammar. And of course, from the teacher's point of view, that is completely obvious. You can teach someone a grammar rule and test whether someone can reproduce that grammar rule, and then you've apparently learned something. Whether the development, which is much more vague, cannot be taught, actually. And learning is a process, but we need grades. We need assessments. So that's the last point that I wanted to go into, and that is the need for grades as opposed to learning as a process. So talking about testing. If we realize, and this is just observations, that this is the pattern of development for learning and the different competencies. If we measure at this point in time, indicated by the arrow, we may have a different outcome from when we measure at this point in time. So, is there something like the real competence? Maybe, but that was what Case the Bot was referring to on Thursday night. I can claim that I can run the marathon in 2 hours and 10 minutes. That may be my competence, but, well, it doesn't turn out to be the case. So you simply will never know what the competence is. And that makes sense because the performance, if that's what you're looking at, is highly variable. And then, of course, there's the complication of all these different components developing at their own time scale. And the time scale being, and the time scale there being, and I'll skip this one. Sorry about this. It's very unprofessional to skip slides, but it's not working. And then we've seen that the scale on the left-hand side from A1 to C2 is not a linear scale either. Yeah, so that the distances between the scale points are not the same, which complicates matters further. So how can we test knowing this? Even within the level of vocabulary, for instance, and this is from a study by the PhD study by Tal Kaspi, who investigated vocabulary development and looked at 4 levels of vocabulary development. And we can roughly say there are 2 levels: receptive and productive knowledge of vocabulary, and also something that came back in one of the talks this week, these past days. And then you can very clearly see that there is hardly any development in the productive levels, and quite a bit more in the in-between levels, and Tal distinguished 4 different levels. So even when we look at vocabulary development and we look at different levels of vocabulary development, there is an interesting interaction and change and variability over time of vocabulary development in itself. So in that sense, there's also a sort of recursive patterns that we find. And the fact that the way that the different patterns are not obviously related is illustrated in this picture. When one grows, the other one can go down as a result of that, maybe because of the attention or the resources that are available, and maybe sometimes there's a delayed effect. So you can see that it's a very complex interaction, hence complex system. The next slide is from excuse me, from a study that we did and that was presented yesterday by Cercles Seminar in this conference, the Embed project, where we found that the range was quite different from the accuracy in one of the learners. And the focus here is not on the extent to which the different raters agree, but on the fact that there's no such thing as a flat profile. So someone can be very good at pronunciation, but not very good at vocabulary, or the other way around. And that's also something that we found in one of the talks, I think one of the Belgian talks, where we had to vote what the level of proficiency was. And then there was some agreement that some components of that speaker was B1, and others were C1. Yeah? So there was a wide range of characteristics for the same learner. So there's no flat profile, which is a problem for assessment. But because can we say that B2 for vocabulary and C1 for accuracy and C2 for pronunciation altogether is B2 or C2? The C2 doesn't make sense anyway. But it's difficult because these are ordinal scales. The distances on the scale points are not the same. So we simply, what has been done then is to convert them to numbers and calculate the average. But we're not allowed to because the scale points are not, the distances are not the same. And so this is a big problem. We cannot simply, from different assessments, come to one final assessment. We cannot add them up and divide them by 4 or so. So the Common European Framework type of assessment is useless if not done in agreement with the framework. And this is also something that we talked about this week. And that means that if we want to assess according to the framework, we have to start with the specification of the task. Because if I ask someone if he or she can order bread at the baker's, you can never do that at the C2 level. Yeah? So you have to start at the specification of the task. then we need standardization and validation, and those are the familiar steps. Those steps are the steps that we have to go through. Otherwise, there's no use in assessing using the labels. There was a hyperlink, but I decided to skip that, which is a shame. But if there is a question, I can go back to the hyperlink. So maybe ideally, we would want to say that this learner's proficiency level is B2, full stop. But this is the assessment at one moment in a process, and it does not take into account the multi-dimensionality of proficiency. And so maybe we can say that the core European framework is perfect for profiling, but not for leveling. So we can create a learner profile. And holistic global assessment does probably not do justice to the learner's competencies, as we've seen in the fact that we have not been able, in many cases, to find flat profiles. Which is not a problem, as long as you don't strive for a flat profile, as long as you don't want to say that a learner has one level. So conclusions. The European framework was created for self-evaluation. It's a framework of reference in combination with portfolio use, very essential, very important. For that it's really excellent, and it focuses on what learners can do from a communicative point of view, so very much in line with what we know about language development. And it shows how learners develop over time, and using an electronic language portfolio for that is really the best way of doing it. It is also suitable for proficiency assessment, as long as it's done in agreement with the framework, and acknowledges the multidimensional and variable nature of language proficiency. Now this seems to be a paradox, and I cannot resolve that paradox. And so the questions that I would like to raise for the discussion are how can we bridge the gap between what we know about language development and what is happening in practice? There is a big gap. Is the Common European Framework a tool for learners or instrument for teachers, language testers, or maybe publishers? So what is this is a question about ownership. And that's a question that I think, it's awkward actually, maybe you should be asking the questions, but since we're having the panel discussion right after this, I will be asking the questions this time. And do we need profiles, or do we need levels? So a very convenient statement like your TOEFL score is 560. Yeah? You know where you are. Can the Common European Framework do something similar? Is that a valuable thing to do? Probably that's what we need. And we can probably change the Common European Framework, we can change the descriptors, we can refine the electronic language portfolios, and we've seen some excellent examples of that this morning. But how can we make sure that it will be used in practice? Because if it's not or hardly being used, then it's all in vain. Now it will be used, of course, by the small number of people who are at the forefront, but in the broad sense, as we saw thus far, after 10 years, it's barely being used. To the extent that, oh yes, it's being used in the sense that everyone uses the labels. But that's not, of course, the nature of the true nature, doing justice to the true nature of the Common European Framework. I'd like to thank you for your attention.